welcome to All Rise. And for those tuning in, you're going to notice something very different this week. The table's gone.
Tables have turned.
The tables have turned. They're gone. And instead of a table, we have Andy Bannister. Much better than a table. A lot of people have said that about you.
I've been compared to many things before, Derek, but not household furniture. But there's a first time for everything.
There you go. Well, a banister.
Oh, I've never heard that joke before.
Yeah.
Actually, about banisters. That's
really
comedy originality, right?
Oh, yeah.
Comedy.
To quote Pee Wee Herman, I laughed so hard I almost fell off my dinosaur. So, but
some have the gift of comedy, Derek.
Yeah.
Others.
Right.
Just spiritual gift.
So today, though, we are talking about Abdu and I have been doing a bit of a series talking about Islam. We've talked about just the idea of God in Islam. We've talked about Jesus in Islam, and today we have a Qur'an expert to talk about the Qur'an, just to give people a good basic understanding of even what it is, but then some of the contested issues with it, the arguments made in favor of it by Muslim apologists. And so we're going to jump into a lot of that, but we're so happy to have to have our phones muted is one thing we're always happy to have.
Yeah.
By the boss himself.
Yeah.
We're going to keep this in, Zach.
Yeah, you really should. That's a slightly embarrassing thing that just happened. All right.
It's like Joe is here with us. People don't know Joe. He works with us. He's in his 80s, and his phone rings a lot.
Yeah, but if you don't know Joe, you should, because
he's a great guy.
But anyway,
yeah.
Okay, back to
what we're actually
I am excited, however, for a number of reasons. One of those is that Andy and I haven't been in the same room together in a long time. We've been communicating over Zoom and WhatsApp and that kind of thing for years now, but really since COVID. One, because you're obviously in Europe and in Scotland, and not necessarily a drive away. Or even a short flight, but you've been spending some time here in the U.S. and just delighted to have you physically in studio with us. You've been on the show recently talking about your book, Have You Ever Wondered? And which was a great episode. Thoroughly enjoyed that. But it's just great to actually be with you in person, with the family and everything, to have you in studio. So you're actually the first in-studio guest of our new studio here. So we're excited about that. I feel
very, very, very honored.
Yeah.
I'll try not to break the furniture.
Yeah. Or
again, that was me, though. That was me.
All right.
A little behind the scenes.
But anyway, I'm also excited because of your expertise in this specific area of the Qur'an and the oral formulation of the Qur'an, all that. We're going to get into all this stuff. So I'm really looking forward to that. Speaking on this important topic because, as you said, we've been doing this series now on Islam for a while. We've alluded to the Qur'an and some of the issues with understanding the Qur'an and its origins, but this is going to be a pretty deep dive into it. So, yeah, it's awesome to have you, man.
It's great to be here, and it's especially great to be here sitting down because sitting down, you and I are about the same height. When we used to,
yes, indeed,
yeah.
We picked this chair, by the way, because it's a little higher.
That's very kind.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very kind of you. There is a slight height differential between Abdu and I for people watching at home.
If we can do this, and I want to do this, you and I were speaking somewhere together, and Andy is a whiz with like things computer, and he created a graphic image of me and him speaking together.
Yes.
And I just want to throw it up there real quick when we get a chance. So if you can text us or email us the image. We'll throw it up on here so you can see it. It highlights the differences between the two of us for you to see, and that showed. So here, this is what it looks like. Okay, and that is a good encapsulation of when Andy and I give our road tour. The long and the short of it. We'll be calling it.
We should so do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, let's get into the serious stuff.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we're talking about the Quran, and I thought let's start off because a lot of what we've done is, we have the people who watch our show are various levels of kind of knowledge on Islam. As I mentioned before, it's a lot to sort of get into. At first, there's a lot of information there. But I think what surprises a lot of people when they first pick up a Quran is they think, I'm going to be reading something like the Bible. We're going to have the story of Muhammad's life. We're going to have the story of the early movement. We're going to have, these almost something like Paul's letters that set out something like theology or something like that. When you actually open up the Quran, that's not quite what you find. There are stories. Would you say it's closer to wisdom literature? Is it like folk beliefs about ancient stories? Is it like what are they actually finding when they open up and there's these stories in these interesting titles, and it's just it's like a very strange thing.
It is a very strange thing, and as you say, certainly as a Christian reader of the Qur'an, so when you first pick the Qur'an up and open it, so it's about the same length as the New Testament, is the best thing, 114 chapters or surahs, 6,200 verses. And one of the first things you notice, Derek, straight away is the Qur'an chops and changes topic quite regularly. So if you're reading the Bible, you're used to, quite protracted narratives, right? I mean, take the Gospels. I mean, each of the Gospels is one continuous narrative, what the Book of Acts is, or in the Old Testament. If you're reading some of the stories of, say, David or so on, we're used as Christian or Jewish readers to quite long periods of narrative. Quran doesn't really do that. Maybe 2-3 verses at most, it'll hold topic, continuous story, and then suddenly change to the next. That's the first thing. Next thing you find is the Quran sort of assumes quite a lot of knowledge on the behalf of the reader. So it will often say things like, consider the story of, and will then cite an earlier story, perhaps a biblical story or someone from a sort of Arabian religious tradition, clearly assuming that the first readers or hearers of the text are familiar with that. Okay. So if you're not familiar with that background, it can be incredibly confusing at times. And then the other thing that strikes a Christian reader, I think, as different is the Quran is presented throughout as the words of Allah, a God speaking. It's all presented as if this is the first person direct speech of God, which is one of the reasons that Muslims treat it with the reverence they do. But put all those things together, yes, it can be a hard read. And not just, by the way, for those coming from a different tradition like us as Christians or our Jewish friends. Muslims find it a hard read, which is why many Muslims I know don't actually read the Quran in huge amounts. There's quite a lot of ignorance of their own text. They may perhaps listen to others read it. They may, if they're a very faithful Muslim, go to the mosque on a Friday and hear the Imam expound it. They may have tried to memorize a little bit of it in Arabic. By the way, even if they're not English Arabic speakers, I have Muslim friends in the UK who don't speak Arabic but have tried their best to memorize a few verses, because there's almost this sense that just by reciting it, that's where the power and the blessing, the obedience to God comes from. So I think the first thing to remember or understand, it's a very different book to the Bible. It's not the same kind of book. It's not the same kind of literature. I don't even think it's doing the same thing, because really for Muslims, the Quran is considered to be the ultimate revelation of God, of Allah. There've been the previous scriptures. Along comes the Quran, the supreme revelation of God. For Christians, it's Jesus who is the supreme revelation of God. And actually, in some ways, maybe a better comparison is not the Quran and the Bible, but the Quran and Jesus. It's been said, and not just by Christian theologians, some Muslim theologians have observed that actually, in Islam, the word of God becomes a book. In Christianity, the word of God becomes a man.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of that's right on. That's dead on, because when a Muslim talks about what the Quran is, they will essentially say it is the revealed will of God. Which is why it doesn't have the same structure as the Bible at all. And so, yeah, you're 100% right, is that this is essentially the incarnation, for lack of a better word, of the will of God for humanity. And it's the best representation they have of God's will. And Jesus, as the incarnation, would be the best representation, or the image of the invisible God, as it were, for Christians. So that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I think that what you're hitting on too is so important too, because when I've had Christians open up a Quran and start to read it and have a tough time getting through it, partly because it is tough to get through, but second, because they come with an expectation that it'll be similar to their religious tradition. And I remember reading a book called In Search of the Original Quran by a Muslim actually named Manhar Sfar. And he talks about the fact that there is this almost patchwork quilt-like quality of the Quran, where you have inheritance laws coupled right next to a story that kind of has nothing to do with that, coupled with another story that starts in the middle, coupled with not just inheritance laws, but laws about punishment or capital this, or a recollection of a prophet who is not necessarily a Christian or a Jewish prophet, and of a people that no one really knows about outside of the Muslim context. So it's got this patchwork feel to it as well. So it's quite different in that respect.
I think that's quite a good analogy, actually, the patchwork quilt analogy. I think the other thing as well, connecting what Abdu said there, Derek, with your point, Derek, that about how Muslims approach the Quran. I think the other thing that many Muslims aren't aware of, and it'd be interesting to get your perspective, Abdu, that when you came from that Muslim background years ago, how you encountered this, that because of that patchwork quilt analogy, the Quran doesn't actually make a lot of sense on its own. A lot of Muslims, I think, in my view, sort of subconsciously recognize that, but struggle to articulate it. By which I mean, if you just read the Quran, you really struggle. So the way that most Muslims read the Quran is they read it through the lens of the later traditions, the Hadith. Now, if you came from a Shiite background, so you had your particular collections of Hadith, our Sunni friends have theirs. But really, most Muslims that I know today will read the Quran through that lens of the later traditions about what Muhammad said and did, because you can't make sense of it otherwise. You need something to help you interpret it. Then behind even that, you have layers of commentary on the Quran, what we call tafsir, centuries of Muslim scholars commentating on the Quran. So it's almost like you have these lenses stacked up between you, the modern day Muslim reader, and the Quran to make sense of it. And then the other thing that's fascinating, all of those earlier traditions and stories that the Quran refers to, something like a quarter, 25% of the Quran, Derek, consists of the Quran retelling or alluding to former Jewish and Christian material, but often in a way that doesn't tell you the whole story. And early Muslim scholars, and this is really important to when we're as Christians talking to our Muslim friends, because Muslims today will often, leap for the argument the Bible's been corrupted. That belief was not really held widely by very early Muslim scholars.
Right.
The earliest Muslim commentators on the Quran, they mined the former scriptures because they needed to. They needed to go and draw on that material to understand the Quran. So you read, one of the giants of, early Muslim exegesis on the Quran, someone like Tabari, writing in the early 900s. He is very happy to grab large chunks of the Bible and draw upon it and cite it in his commentary on the Quran, because you need to know those stories to understand the Quran. And it's often been said, it was almost as if early Muslim commentators and clerics draw that material into their commentary, and then they shut the doors and went, no, you must not look at the Bible, after having, spent centuries busily drawing upon it. So to Muslims who get a little bit jumpy on, we only need the Quran, well, that's actually not true. Without the Bible behind it, the Quran is largely meaningless.
Well, there was, not only that, but there's, and I want to get into that in a second too, because there's a whole branch of things I want to talk about.
This is going to be a long podcast.
Feel free to jump in.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. One is, in terms of my reaction to that, is that when you read it, you do begin to get like a little, wait a minute, did I miss something? Because it just mentioned a name. And the way in which the Quran mentions that name of this particular person or these people or whoever it might be suggests that I should know who that is. And did I miss it in the context of the surah I'm reading, or the ayahs, the various verses of the Quran I'm reading? I must have missed something. And you look back, you're like, nope, it's not mentioned. This person's not mentioned. So it assumes you know these things. And then even with some of the theological claims or ideas and whatever it might be, there are contexts in which that verse is revealed. So when you look at some of the tafsir and you look at some of the hadith, they'll say, well, this verse seems to suggest this, but you realize it was given after this thing happened. So with regard to some of the Quranic narrative about the Bible, for example, the way the Quran references the Bible in very, very positive terms. In fact, one of the reasons I became a Christian was because the Quran actually refers to the Bible in very positive terms. There are some verses that suggest that Jews and Christians had changed the context or the meanings of the verses of the Bible in order to sort of deceive people away from Muhammad's prophetic office. And so some of the context of the tafsir is, this verse that says that they change the context or they use their tongues to twist the meaning, the hadith literature and the tafsir will say that's because this verse was revealed right after Jews challenged Muhammad on like the stoning laws for adultery, and they try to cover it up with their actual physical hand.
That's right.
And so that verse of the Quran came after that thing happened. And so there is a history, but it's a super implied, or almost, you have to get through several lenses, several layers to get to that history. Yeah. But if you're reading it on its own, you're like, why did it jump to there? You just said how great the book was, but now you're saying they changed the context of it. In order to make sense of that, you have to know this background knowledge.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of things like that.
Yeah. And by the way, a really good example of how, if you don't know that background, well, firstly, if you don't know that background knowledge, you're in real trouble. And secondly, actually, and here we're going to get into some of the more kind of sort of critical work that's been done on the Quran over the years. I think there's a huge issue to Abdu. When you start asking questions about those lenses, you begin to conclude that actually the first generation of Muslim scholars actually had no idea what was going on. And the illustration I often use of this comes from, there was a really highly regarded Western critical scholar who worked on Islam for many years, Patricia Crona, based at Princeton University here in the US for many years. And she wrote a book called Mech and Trave, looking at some of the historical issues around the origins of Islam. But in that, she has a little discussion about the Hadith. And she uses it as her test case, the 106th chapter of the Quran, Surah 106, very short chapter. And by the way, if you've never read the Quran, you're listening to this and you're interested, go look that up on the internet. Very short chapter. And it talks about how Muhammad's tribe, he was part of a tribe called the Quraysh in Mecca, how they would go on 2 journeys during the summer and the winter, and they were afraid, but it was all right because Allah protected them from fear. And so Patricia, takes that surah and says, the inquisitive reader immediately begins asking some questions. Well, what journeys? Where were they going? What were they doing? What was the fear? What was the problem? What did they encounter? And how did Allah protect them? All these kind of questions arise. Right, she says, let's go to the earliest commentators on the Quran, sort of 100 to 200 years after the death of Muhammad, and see what they tell you. And she said it's astonishing. For every single one of those kind of questions, you can find 15, 20, 30 different opinions. Maybe they went there, maybe they went there, maybe it was this, maybe the issue was they were facing famine or droughts or sandstorms or attacks from tribes or fear from being away from. So you look at all this wealth of suggestions and you can only arrive at the conclusion the first generation of Muslim commentators had no idea what the original context was. Maybe the right answer is in here somewhere. When she coins this little phrase, she says, how do we explain the fact this earliest generation of Muslim commentators had suffered exegetical memory loss in just a few decades?
Yeah.
And it raises all kinds of questions about the origins of the Quran.
Yeah.
But it does, when I talk to Muslim friends, I want to gently raise the question, how do you know that these commentators on the Quran, on whom you are relying, either consciously or subconsciously, how can you be sure they actually really knew what they were talking about? But without those lenses, the Quran, it's an interesting document.
Well, there was
obviously meaningless.
I was having a conversation yesterday on the radio with someone who's asking about the history. What can we know about the history of the life of Muhammad, the life of early Muslims, et cetera, et cetera? And there's basically 3 different approaches. You can take a historical critical approach. You can take a traditional approach that just takes the traditions and just agrees with them. And then you can take a highly skeptical approach. I think there's 3 different, probably more than that. I think Patricia Crona and Tom Holland in The Shadow of the Sword and a few others.
Michael Cook and others, Hagerism, for example, that classic book.
Someone would take a little more of a skeptical approach. Well, we can't know anything. Now, what they're not saying, this is important, a lot of them are not saying there is no real history here, that Muhammad wasn't a real person. They're not necessarily saying that. They're just saying, basically what you're saying is that because there's no real, who knows? It's not like there's nothing happened. It's that we just don't know.
No. And there's certainly, put it this way, that the curious thing, I'm a great believer in just leaning on the phrase, the curious thing is
yes.
Right. I think you mentioned in your introduction, Derek, that, if you don't know the Quran, you'd come to it going, well, I expect this is going to tell me about Muhammad and the things he did. Muhammad's only mentioned by name, 4 times, I think, in the Quran, which is interesting. Then the other thing I find fascinating is it takes over 100 years for biographical writing of Muhammad's biography to begin. The earliest we have is Ibn Ishaq, who is writing in about the sort of 700s, isn't he? And then we only have his biography preserved 100 years later in Ibn Hisham. So look, whatever is going on, the conclusion you have to draw is the earliest Muslims were not especially interested in the biography of Muhammad because they did such a terrible job of preserving it. Just contrast that with the Gospels and Christianity for a moment. Before we even get into which claim is true, what you cannot avoid is the conclusion that the earliest Christians were deeply concerned with the biography of Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, the dating for the Gospels, certainly all four Gospels, I think date before AD 70. And I think dating of the Gospels has shifted earlier in recent years. Mark's Gospel, you can take someone like, say, Mark James Crossley, who's an atheist New Testament scholar in the UK. I mean, he's argued vociferously in recent years we should be dating Mark into the 30s. Well, certainly
I look that up.
Yeah.
Mark, fascinating individual. He's not a Christian, but he thinks all the signs are there that this is incredibly early. But the point being is, within a couple of decades or so, the first Christians are writing down the Jesus tradition. It takes Muslims 100 to 200 years to get that figured out. That is just, at the very least, interesting.
It's at least the very least curious.
It's a very British phrase, I realize. Interesting, with raised eyebrow.
Well, one of the things I think that I would say if I were a Muslim hearing that, what I would say is that and there's some pushback I'm going to have back on this in my own statement as well, though, is that that is the difference. That goes back to the thing you mentioned, is that we're not really comparing Jesus or Muhammad or the Bible and the Qur'an. We're comparing the Qur'an and Jesus.
Yes.
So Christians were far more interested in the biography of Jesus because they saw him as God, the Word made flesh. So the Bible is the Word of God about God, the Word made flesh. But in the Qur'an, the central miracle is the revelation of the Qur'an. Muhammad is a conduit for that, and his life story is important, but not ultimate in that sense, because Muhammad is the central figure of Islam, but it's the Qur'an that's the central thing about Islam. However,
yes, pushback on your pushback.
Yeah,
I think this is interesting.
Yeah, my pushback is, and I'd love to get your comment on this, is that though the Qur'an says all prophets are equal, and we make no distinction among them,
yes,
Muslims really do. But also the Qur'an also says things like obey Allah and His Messenger.
That's the formula, right?
So there you go. So
yes, I always think of George Orwell, right? 1984. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
Yeah,
all prophets are equal. I mean, a couple of thoughts on there. You're absolutely right. I think that's a fair comment. The interesting thing is how we got from that position to today, where it's almost the case. And I've raised this question with Muslim friends, right? You can sort of pretty much say what you want about Allah, but you critique Muhammad, and life can get exciting and brief quite quickly, depending on where you are in the world. So Muhammad has become so sacrosanct. So how have we gone from? And by the way, in some sects of Islam, I mean, Muhammad almost a divine figure. I mean, there's a whole discussion there about what the Sufis have done, him kind of sharing in the light of Allah. But the other interesting point is, even if we take your comment there as a given, firstly, of course, the miraculous nature of the Quran in Islam is dependent upon Muhammad's status. The Quran is only a miracle if you have it revealed to, this illiterate guy who hasn't got access to reading and writing. So the two things go together.
That's a good point.
So you can't have a miraculous Quran without talking about the conduit through which it's come, number one. Secondly, the Quran does only mentions Muhammad 4 times. It does bang on a lot about the apostle of Allah. That's the phrase that's often used, about Allah and the apostle. Now, Muslims will often, obviously, automatically make the assumption, well, that's Muhammad. But you can't make that assumption unless you have the hadith wrapping around it to do that. And then thirdly, even the idea that the Quran itself is the final ultimate revelation. Muslims hold that belief now. But again, just use that British understatement phrase, it is interesting. As we know, Muhammad dies in 632 AD. A bit unexpectedly. Muslims weren't expecting it. But one of the things that is interesting, when Muhammad dies, there's been no effort to collect the Quran together. There's been no efforts to begin assembling this as a book. I think you could raise the question, did Muhammad understand during his ministry, even if we take the traditions at face value, that what he was being given was what would be a book with 114 chapters with a beginning and an end and organized a certain way? Because if so, he left no instructions on how to do that. Because if you read those early traditions, you can see the Muslim community is thrown into disarray when he dies. And then when the first collection begins under the first caliph, Abu Bakr, that's a sort of panicked exercise, if you recall, because the reports come to the caliph, we've got a problem because people who'd memorized parts of the Quran are dying in battle. We're losing that generation. We need to get this thing recorded because otherwise we're going to lose this stuff. That does not, to me, to suggest a community who knew they'd been given for God's final revelation. We knew what it was like. We just had a bit of polishing to do.
Yeah,
it's pretty chaotic.
Yeah, and that a Muslim would say, well, the Quran says basically this is a book revealed to you, and I perfected your religion for you, suggesting that there is a communication to Muhammad that says this is it, it's done. However, the Muslim tradition also says that the Qur'an wouldn't be closed until Muhammad was gone, because there was always a possibility he would receive revelation. But you're right, one could argue, I'm not sure I can make an historical argument for this, but one could argue that even a statement like that says, we're done, this is a perfected religion, this revelation is perfected. First of all, it's not, as far as I can remember, in the latest surah. But second, let's say it was, one could say that was injected back into the text after the compilation, because it doesn't seem like there was there was a concern for what do we do with this thing? What do we do with this collection of phrases? Are we going to make it into a book? Is it supposed to be a book? Is it supposed to be going out to the world?
I think you'd absolutely make that argument, and a couple of other pieces of evidence. And again, I think it's very important when we're offering a critique of Islam to, be clear about these are big questions that we need to think about, and these are clearly massive problems, which there's huge evidence. I mean, there are massive issues with the Quran where we're on incredibly strong ground. Then there's this area in the middle where I think things are still a bit more fluid in terms of the scholarship. But look, you could argue this, couldn't you? That collection under Abu Bakr that I mentioned, the first collection under the Quran, two things intrigue me in that narrative there in the Hadith. One is that when that suggestion is put to Abu Bakr, if you remember, there are other voices, other people say, well, how can you do what Muhammad never did? That's the critiques that's made. So there are those who are saying, no, you should never, don't you dare do this. That's a terrible idea. Interesting. Then we're also told, if you remember, Abu Bakr gives the task of going and collecting the Quran to Muhammad's secretary, Zayd ibn Thabit, if you remember. And he is sent out to go around and start trying to collect the Quran. And we're told he collects it for people's memories. People had written parts of the Quran on palm leaves and white stones. I recall bones are listed. So fragments everywhere. And then I think, isn't there the saying where then Zayd is reported to have said, and I found the last verse of the Quran with just one person. Which is astonishing to go, this revelation, this final revelation from God, this incredible thing was so, messy in the way it had been, recorded, that literally the last bit that you grabbed, just one person said, well, I've got this verse and no one else has got.
Well, and that whole narrative sort of feeds into one of the things that Zayd ibn Thabit was reported to have said was when he was commissioned, including under Uthman, he says, you've commissioned me with an impossible task, something that's almost more impossible than the revelation of the Quran itself.
Yes.
Something along those lines.
Moving a mountain, I think, is the other. In another tradition, he said it would be easier if they asked me to move a mountain than to try and collect the Quran. So all that to say, I think if you could just leave that, you could just park the argument on the earliest Muslim community, right back after the death of Muhammad in 632, that first generation, that Muhammad had not clued them up to the idea that what he had in mind was a book.
Yeah.
A completed book.
So with this in mind, I want to segue something, because what I don't want people to think is that you and I are just saying this as two Christians and Derek's asking us questions about this. Let's hear from a Muslim voice about the complex compilation of the Quran, specifically one of the leading Muslim voices who basically, when he was asked on his show, The Quran Speaks, our good friend Shabir, he basically says, look, it's got a complex history.
Yeah.
And so we're not just saying it. Shabir Ali, who you and I both have been dialoguing debates with before, is actually saying it. So let's hear from Shabir about an inquiry about this, because again, I don't want it to be saying that two Christians are saying this. Shabir Ali, one of the leading voices for Islamic apologetics, is agreeing with us. Here's the clip.
Dr. Shabir, the question today is about the validity of a Quran. Someone wrote, I'm a devout Muslim, reverted to Islam from Christianity 10 years ago. Recently, they came across your debate that you had with Jay Smith, where he mentions the different Qurans found across the globe, such as Uzbekistan and Topkapi, etc. And he makes mentions that there are some versions that are not complete and seem to believe that there are differing Qurans, and as a result, may not be alike in content. So the viewer is asking for your perspective and response on that.
Yeah. So in that debate, what I tried to do was to say, okay, if we just don't look for a moment at all of the complexity of the way in which the text has been transmitted throughout history, look at the text that we're holding in our hands today, and we see that this text actually has miraculous features. More specifically, we see numerical patterns in this text, which obviously has to be credited to God. It does not seem that this just came by coincidence. And of course, we went through a whole detailed treatment of that on our show here. So so there's no need to repeat that now. But my point simply is that the Quran that we have in our hands today, this is proven to be miraculous, and this is proven to be from God, so we don't need to worry too much about the details of the transmission of the text throughout history. Yet, of course, Muslims need to know that part of our history as well. And confusion arises when we think about that, because many Muslims just simply have this the simplistic idea that there has only been one version of the Quran throughout history, and that's the version that we're holding now. And when we read our history, we see, in fact, that there were variations, multiple readings that were sanctioned, the multiple readings that are sanctioned in our tradition, and they do not know how to come to grips with that. It's a large subject. It takes a whole book to describe this in detail, but I'll try to make sense of it very, very quickly in the limited time that we have. The Quran was revealed to our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by the angel Gabriel. He recited that to his companions, but apparently he didn't recite it just one way. He might have recited it in a multiple of ways to make it easy for various companions to grasp the message and to transmit that to their followers as well, and to various tribes who spoke a variety of Arabic dialects. So almost you can have a translation. As you might have a translation from Arabic to English, you can also have a translation from Arabic to Arabic, because not all Arabic is the same.
And at the time
dialects.
it was oral tradition, right?
It was oral tradition. And then the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, themselves may have allowed some latitude when they taught the Quran to others, because people couldn't pronounce the words exactly. They allowed them to pronounce a variety so long as the main meaning was captured and the message was not distorted. But of course, the God guided the early Muslims to put some kind of limits on this process, so that the Quran would not go out of control, but the original message would be retained and passed down to us throughout the generations as we have it now intact as the Word of God.
Perfect explanation. Thanks very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Oh, my word.
Perfect.
Yeah,
we've talked
earlier. Go ahead.
Well, just the idea that you've made this claim about perfectly transmitted, perfectly what would even the word preserved Quran, and then you're given some examples by one of your major defenders that it wasn't necessarily perfectly preserved or even given the same message to each person, and the response is perfect.
Yeah,
which is just we thought seemed like that's an odd response to getting your sort of apologetic defeated.
Well, by the way, I'd love to get your take in a minute, Abdu. The other thing that strikes me before we dig into any of the content on that, Derek, is listening to that. Two things strike me. Firstly is just the only way that Shabir can deal with the massive issues that we have in the transmission of the Quran, because the scholarship has grown on this in recent years, is to go, we've got all this complexity and all these problems and all these different variant readings, and it's very confusing and very complex, but don't worry, I've got a magic mathematical argument that will solve the whole problem, which we'll come to that in a minute. Secondly, I also begin to appreciate why Shabir is, on the one hand, very well known, but I think he's quite a controversial voice among Muslims. This started some years ago, actually. I don't know if you remember this story where I think I did a debate with the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig. It's the first time I heard him do this publicly, where he pronounced that he believes that Jesus was in fact crucified and then swooned on the cross, didn't actually die, comes around to the tomb, and that's where the resurrection stories come from.
Yeah.
That is pretty much a heretical position in mainstream Islam. It's come from a sect of Islam, actually. I think.
Yeah, the Ahmadis believe that Jesus was on the cross but survived, and then ended up getting married in Kashmir.
Now, he's got that from his mentor, a guy called Ahmed Deedat, a South African Muslim debater who was the first to do that, but has been heavily criticized. Now he's using this, which I think many Muslims would go, hang on a minute, buddy, are you now saying the Quran has got all these differences? And I did a debate with Shabir back in, I think, 2017 at the Master University in Toronto, where he equally, we talked about the fact that he believed in that debate that Jesus to be not a human figure, but a sort of supernatural figure somewhere between human and divine. And then he's also on record now having said he believes the Quran contains fables and legends and stories, not actual history. Because again, I think what he's grappling with, Abdu, he's a very bright guy.
Very.
He reads very widely, and I think he just realizes where the evidence now is. And so he therefore has to try and sort of retrofit that with yes, we've got all of these problems. but I've got this sort of magic mathematical thing that I can.
Yeah.
It's the only thing he's got left.
Well, and that's one thing I appreciate about him, and doing a dialogue with him one time, and then seeing his other dialogues as well with you, with friends of ours, is that he will go where the scholarship leads, and he'll have to concede to something like the fact that there isn't this simplistic idea of how we got the Qur'an at all. It's a much more complicated history. He basically acknowledges that. And he even talked about the different ahruf, the different readings, the qira'at, all the various ways in which Muslims had come to understand what the Qur'an was. And then he makes this interesting statement because he recognizes the scholarship on this. But he also says something really interesting that I thought was fascinating, as he said there were variations. We needed to put a lid on this so it doesn't get out of control. Well, I know he said God guided them so that there would be these limitations on this, so it wouldn't get out of control, and that's fine. But the meaning was retained, and nothing of the essential message was changed. Now, I've heard him and other Muslims say that the Bible has all these variants. You have all these variants in the Bible, and the woman caught in adultery, and the stuff in John's letters about the Trinity. This stuff isn't really in the originals, and so you have all these things. And so the Christian response has been, we know what the variants are. We know what the original said based on the way we can compare the variants to one to the other. And based on that, we have a really good idea of what the text originally said. And none of the variants changes anything meaningful. That's the exact same argument he used. And she, in response, was excited about it. So if a Christian makes the same argument about the Bible, shouldn't we be equally able to be excited about that response? It seems to me we should be able to as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think so. And by the way, the other little cherry on top of the cake on that one is that, as you know, Muslim theology, the mainstream Orthodox position for 1400 years has been that Muhammad was the last prophet. That was the close of Revelation. Mm-hmm. If you take Shabir's argument, you now have to go, well, actually, that's not strictly true. God is working through and inspiring those people who are Abu Bakr in that first collection, Whitman in that next collection, Zaid as he edits. So all those people who are involved, they may not be prophets directly, but God's process is still going on. And so that revelation period does sort of actually extend beyond the ministry of Muhammad. That begins to get a little bit grey now, as to go, so when does the period of inspiration end? Is it with Muhammad, or is it going on under this right into the 9th century when the readings are being clarified? So yeah.
Well, I would go one further.
Go one further.
Because the work that he has done on the miraculous number system within the Qur'an is based on the work of, and I'm forgetting his name, Rashid Khalifa.
Rashid Khalifa.
Yes, he has this whole system because there's this phrase in the Quran. It's one phrase, and it's mysterious. It says, "Over it are 19." That's the whole verse. Over it are 19, and no one knows what this means. Well, he finds this mathematical thing with the number 19, where there's multiples of this number that appear in the Quran, et cetera, et cetera. And Shabir takes that and runs with it. One of the reasons why I bring this up is because Khalifa actually said essentially that he was the last messenger. Not the last apostle, but the last messenger, because he uncovered this thing within the Quran, among other things, and it didn't go well for him. Muslims didn't take well to that. And Shabir would acknowledge that he went too far, but then Shabir would say, but look at all these things I've discovered and some others have discovered in terms of this miraculous nature of the way these numbers pop up and the way the number of verses works this way and these words work this way. Things completely not revealed in any way to Muhammad or the companions or his family, Ahl al-Bayt, as the Shia would say. And so he is pulling something out of the Quran that the early Muslim community didn't even see. And so in some ways that kind of makes Shabir the last messenger.
Well, I think it gets even more, to take your point and then raise it one. It's like you're like playing poker. I'll take your argument and raise it. I think you can make that even stronger, actually, going, if Shabir thinks that the Quran has all of this, I mean, it's complicated, it's chaotic, all of these different readings and variant verses and all these things like he mapped out there and then tried to sort of fluff away. I mean, he mapped out the confusion, but it's okay, because it all comes down to the mathematical precision. That, therefore, would be the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
That is the criteria. Well, that was not done during the work of Muhammad. That was done during the period of the Quran's codification, a 200 to 300 year period before those readings were tidied up. So the most important thing was not revealed to Muhammad. Muhammad didn't know about it. It came later. So therefore, you have a really interesting question of going, it seems to be, Shabir, you're saying Muhammad is the conduit through which the stuff comes, and it's all messy and cloudy and all over the place. But don't worry, the most important thing that Muslims can stake their eternal destiny on doesn't come to Muhammad, comes through a period 200 to 300 years later. So arguably, Zaid Ibn Thabit was at least as important, if not more so, than Muhammad. And and if you want to, we can talk about the numerology bit, because it just is a.
We probably should talk about this at some point. But
let's give people some guardrails, at least to help them kind of walk along this path.
Yeah.
I feel like we sort of got to the end of the conversation first.
Yeah.
Which is we figured would happen with you two.
Yeah. It does happen with that, doesn't it?
But I think if we could go back even, because it is interesting that, since the 19th century, and I'm working on a project right now looking at the authorship of Paul, when people started doubting certain letters and why they started doubting it. It's interesting, since the 19th century, they've been trying to study the New Testament and Old Testament, trying to figure out where did this come. The idea is, can we show that it's unoriginal? Can we that it's derivative of something? Where did the church make this up? Where did they make that up? As a way of undermining the Christian scriptures. And yet it's interesting that in Islamic studies or in Quran studies for the longest time, there was a lot of pushback of, when you're doing that, you're not treating it respectfully. But now in the last, and I don't even know, last few decades, perhaps, the academic study of the Quran has really taken off. And a lot of people, they're getting access to things that maybe you didn't have before. I don't know if it was dangerous before, whatever the case may be. Now there is. So there's a lot of work being done on it.
Yeah. There is.
And we're finally getting to understand the origins of the Quran maybe better than we ever had. Like you've mentioned, there was you could look at the hadith and other things, and you could come up and see, like, there's something messy going on here. But you have a particular study that you've put out. You have a book called an oral formulaic study of the Quran, and the more I read about it, I found it fascinating. So now that we can do this, now that we can kind of see what's going on, and you've already been talking about, there's all these claims about the miraculous nature of God has given something directly to Muhammad, and this is it. But when you look into it, the idea that the Quran is an oral formulaic composition, what does that precisely? In a nutshell, we'll get into more of it. But what does that mean? What made you want to even?
That's very dangerous, asking someone who did a PhD on something. Can you talk about your thesis? Because this could be the next.
By the way, I do find it funny too that one of the Muslim arguments about God is, we don't need a PhD to know who God is, and they're making fun of the Trinity, but apparently you do to actually understand the Quran. So it's not as simple as maybe they've made it up.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start simply with what drove me into the area of research. So that'll help people who are not specialists kind of ground it. So when I first started doing dialogues and debates with Muslims in London in the late 1990s, since the early 2000s, I used to go quite a lot to a place in London called Speaker's Corner, which is part of one of our big parks in London, where you can stand on a ladder or a soapbox on an afternoon, talk about anything, religion, politics, sport. You got a crowd. Lots of Muslims used to go down there to preach Islam, and I began going down there with a guy called Jay Smith, who's been mentioned before on this show, I know, and you can look up Jay's YouTube channel. Jay was preaching down there to Muslims and used to drag along, young, enthusiastic types like me. And I remember meeting Muslims down there, and some of the arguments I first came across were Muslims saying to me things like this. Derek, they would say, look, the Quran is a miracle. And it's a miracle because it was revealed, it came through this guy, Muhammad, and this Muhammad was illiterate. He didn't have access to reading or writing, because Arabia at the time was largely an oral culture. And look, he's produced this great work of literature, and therefore it's a miracle. Ta-da! Now, on first hearing that is not a bad argument. I mean, that sounds quite impressive, right? The Quran is, whatever you think about it, it's a work of literature. Muhammad's illiterate, and therefore we have a miracle. Yeah. And so I began to be quite fascinated by that argument. But I began doing some digging around. And it's not long before you discover, actually, we have lots and lots of great works of literature in world literature that predate writing. As the classic example in the field of orality studies would be Homer, the Greek guy, not the little yellow guy on The Simpsons. Homer, the Greek poet, who wrote his great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are really the foundations of Western literature, certainly. He was writing, he was telling those poems before writing was invented. So whatever he was doing, it wasn't involving writing because they are way too early. And a whole field called orality or oral literary studies arose to explore how he did that. And to cut to the chase, what was discovered is that in oral cultures, there are lots of tools and techniques you have for constructing quite long works of, for want of a better word, literature. And you construct them live in front of an audience. So Homer would have originally told those stories in front of an audience, not from memory, partly from memory, but partly he would have constructed the story live in front of the audience. And eventually, when that material is written down, you can look at it, and if you know what you're doing, you can analyze it. You can go, oh yes, we can see all the number of features here that tell us it was constructed by that way. And by the way, again, just to ground it in the present, we still use live composition in front of an audience. If anyone listening to this, if you have small children around you, if you are a parent or a grandparent, or you've got nephews or nieces, suppose a little 6-year-old comes to you and says, uncle, daddy, auntie, grandma, or whatever, can you tell me the story of Cinderella? And you'll probably go, yes, okay, once upon a time. And you'll tell them that fairy tale. Now, you haven't memorized it. You've just seen enough versions of it, be it Disney or whatever. You were told it as a kid. You can sort of construct it. You've got the Cinderella and the sisters and the glass slipper and the prince. And here's the thing. If at the next day another child came to you and asked for the same thing and you told Cinderella again, and we compared those two stories, they would not be identical. You haven't memorized them word for word. You've constructed them in front of an audience. Now, here's what I did in my PhD. I became fascinated by, okay, the Quran's coming from a period of orality. What about if we analyze it in the same way we've analyzed other oral texts like Homer and so on? Could we show that the Quran has the kind of features you would expect if Muhammad had constructed it live in front of an audience, contemporaneously in front of an audience? And lo and behold, it has all of the features you would expect everywhere. It does not look like this perfect literary document that came directly from heaven through an angel to Muhammad. It looks like exactly you would expect something from the 7th century performed live in front of an audience, constructed that way to look.
What would be some examples of that? So specifically, what does it look like in some of the ancient texts that it's based off of? And then in the Quran, what do you see going on?
Yeah, so let's start with an easy one before we get to the slightly more technical stuff. So that's that Cinderella example I gave you. So if you told that same story to two different children on 2 or 3 days apart, and we recorded you telling that story, Derek, and then we transcribed it and we compared, we'd see similarities. The shape of the story would be the same. As I say, you'd have Cinderella, she is, serving well in the household, the ugly sisters, the slipper. You'd have all of those pieces. It's the same story, but the wording will be different. You've created what we call in orality studies a performance variant, a variant version of the story caused by the fact you've performed it, not memorized it or read it. Come over to the Quran, we see lots of examples of performance variants, the same story retold, but slightly differently. Perhaps the best example, and it's the example I begin with in the academic book I published on this, is there's a story in the Quran called the story of Iblis and Adam.
Yeah.
Right. It's actually originally a Jewish fairy tale, which is controversial in and of itself. It dates back to about 100 BC. It was a rabbinic story told really to shed some light on, Genesis. But the rabbis were not claiming this was scripture. It was a story to help people think religious thoughts, but it's not scripture. But it turns up in the Quran. And in a nutshell, for folks who don't know it, the story goes in the Quran that just after God has created Adam, he brings all the angels into heaven and shows them the newly created Adam, and he tells the angels to bow down and worship Adam, which is interesting in and of itself. Monotheism and so forth. But anyway, all the angels obey and bow down except a guy called Iblis. And Iblis is not an angel, he's a jinn, which is sort of class of spiritual being. And he refuses, and he has a bit of a hissy fit. He goes, I'm not going to bow down and worship this guy. He's made of clay. I'm made of fire. Give over. I paraphrase slightly. And as a result of this, Allah curses him, casts him down to earth, where he becomes the Satan figure in the Quran, and then says, well, in return, I'm gonna tempt human beings and cause chaos. That story occurs 7 times. I was going to do the hand gesture there. 7 times in the Quran. And what's interesting, every telling is different. There are some short ones, some long ones. The wording is different. Exactly what Iblis says is different. Exactly how it plays out is different. Same story every time. Adam, a command to bow, a refusal, a curse. Yeah. But the shape of the story is a classic performance variant. Another example would be the Annunciation to Mary, when the angel comes to Mary and announces she's going to have Jesus. You can compare those 2 stories. There are some similarities. There are some differences. Lots of examples. Very hard to explain if this is word for word, from a written text. Much easier to explain if Muhammad has just told that story, Iblis and Adam, 7 times to different audiences. It's been recorded differently each time. So that'd be the first thing. Pretty easy to understand because we can see how we'd have that today.
Yeah. Is there any indication in the Quran that they thought that was actually the scripture and not stories they were getting? Or are they fully aware of we're partaking in?
Well, let me answer that in 2 ways. Firstly, to understand what's going on there, we have to understand, I think, what Muhammad's doing. That'll help give us some framing to this. I think the best explanation we have for the Quran is this. Muhammad, if you take the hadith at face value, Muhammad was deeply passionate about the Arabic people, very concerned for his people, loved his nation, his people, very concerned they were not a nation. They were this disparate bunch of tribes fighting with each other half the time. Muhammad looks around and he sees that around him are 2 great empires. On the one side, you have the Byzantine Empire, Christian Empire. On the other side, you have the Persian, Zoroastrian, 2 great empires that, by the way, had been at war with each other for ages. Muhammad then asked himself, what have these guys got in common? Well, they've got a religion. They've got a book. They've got scripture is central. What my people need is a book, is a religion. And he decides, I'm going to be the one to give it to them. But what do you do? How do you build this thing? Well, Arabia is also full of religious traditions. You've got Jews in there, Christians in there, sort of Arabian monotheists known as Hanifs who were worshipping some kind of god, other traditions. And all these, in oral cultures, Derek, religious stories, as do other stories, just circulate. People, when they come together in the marketplaces to trade, they tell each other traditions. Muhammad, I think, takes it upon himself to go, well, I'm just going to go fishing. I'm going to have that story and that story. Oh, that's a good story. That's an interesting story I've just heard. And what he's basically doing is retelling stories, repackaging stories with an Islamic spin that he's hearing circulating around. That's why these stories come in. And Muhammad not being literate, not having access, say, to the Torah or to the New Testament, when he hears the story of Iblis and Adam, he's not able to go, well, that's not scripture. To his mind, that's a really good story. That's a really powerful. It explains where Satan comes from, and yes, I'll take that, and then I'm going to retell it, and so on and so forth. That's where that comes from. Now that gives you a problem today as a contemporary Muslim, right? Because now you've got essentially fairy tales and legends in the Quran.
Right.
Shabir, like Ali, who we heard from earlier. Shabir is on record, actually. I used this when I debated him in Canada at that last debate. He's on record as saying, yes, there are legends and fairy tales in the Quran. And Shabir's defense would be, and maybe we'll put this quote up on the screen later. Shabir's defense is, well, the Quran is using those as teaching examples. Let me.
It's a parable.
A parable. It's a parable. Help you understand this idea. Here's a story. The problem you have for your Shabir is the Quran doesn't say it's doing that. The little Arabic formula used to introduce, things in the Quran. Remember when is what the Quran says. Remember when, and it tells a story. It uses the same formula to introduce the Iblis and Adam stories as it does to introduce a story of Moses or a story of Abraham or a story of Jesus. So the poor reader of the Quran has to go, okay, which of these is the parable and which isn't? Jesus, by contrast, in the gospel, when he tells a parable, he doesn't jumble it all up with Old Testament history. He says, let me tell you a story to tell you what I'm doing. The Quran doesn't do that, which I think makes it a stretch to do what Shabir is doing. I think it's far more powerful, far more strongly the evidence points that Muhammad didn't know the difference.
I think we actually, one of our episodes, I think we did this, discussed one of those instances. An example of that was when, so the Quran actually has this interesting passage where it says that there are those who write something with their own hands and claim it is from the book. Like, do not be deceived by these people. In other words, people are creating stories, saying it's scripture, and then telling you this is from God. Don't be deceived. But then the Quran includes a story. One of the classic examples that I've referenced, and this kind of really got me when I was studying this stuff before I became a believer, is the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba.
Oh, yes.
Where you have this entire narrative, and I think we may have discussed this on the show before, but you have this entire narrative where the Queen of Sheba comes up because Solomon summons her because the birds told her she's worshiping foreign gods. She comes up to visit Solomon at his court and his chambers, and she sees that his floor is made of glass in his courtyard, and because she's never really seen glass before, she thinks it's water, and she raises the hem of her skirt up to keep it from getting wet. Now, that's where the story ends in the Quran. This is actually borrowed from a Jewish Targum that predates Islam quite a bit, not found in the Bible. No one thought it was in the Bible. It was just, again, an illustrative story meant to just basically tell biblical ideas in a sort of folky kind of a way. And of course, in the Jewish telling of it, the story ends that Solomon is disgusted because when she raises her skirt, her legs are hairy. And he's like, oh, he doesn't want to look at it. That's not in the Quranic version, but this is something that makes its way in very much like that. What I want to ask you, though, is let's get to the import of why this is such an important thing to bring about for Muslims to understand. This is part of, and Shabir mentioned oral tradition. Now, he's talking about oral tradition as preservation of what these things, what the Quran said through the different readings, different understandings, but oral tradition factors in very heavily. And we're not against oral tradition. Christianity has a strong oral tradition. But what is the import of this idea that you have these formulations in the Quran that suggest that various stories were picked up, told and retold, and there were performance variants that made their way into the Quran? Why is that important in terms of the Muslim understanding of how we got the Quran in the first place?
Can we just hold that question for one moment? And because there's a second piece of evidence I think we just want to share for a moment. That's almost as I think even more powerful actually than the performance variance piece. And we'll take this together and then answer that question. So the other thing that we see in oral traditions is the way in oral societies that an oral performer will compose is when you're composing live in front of an audience, you can't afford to think long and hard about every word that you use, right? You know, you and I are both writers, right? Yeah. Write books. You know, we've probably both had that experience, right? Where you're sitting down and going, okay, what's exactly the right word I should use here? Because I want to be precise. In oral cultures, you haven't got the time because the audience is there and you need to keep the speed going. And one of the ways that you do that in oral cultures is you use what's called formulaic language. So you will actually have whole repeated phrases that you use again and again and again that you can throw into your composition. So you haven't got to think about what to say. It's just there in your tradition. And again, contemporary example to help people ground this, we have this today. So if a small child were to come to you, Derek, and say, tell me the story of Cinderella, how do you start a fairy story? What do you say?
Yeah, once upon a time.
Well, you haven't had to think about that. You don't have to think, how do I start? You just know. And in oral cultures, there are hundreds and thousands of those formulas available to a skilled performer, a skilled poet, a skilled orator, that he can draw upon, so he hasn't got to worry about what to say, what comes next. And one of the things that we've done in oral literary studies over the years, one of the tests for orality is you can take a text like Homer's Iliad or Odyssey that we mentioned earlier, and you can analyze it, and you could go, okay, what percentage of this text consists of short, repeated phrases that are recycled time and time again? In contemporary literature, in literate cultures like today, we don't value repetition. You know, if you turned in a book to your publisher and 10% of it was short, repeated phrases, your publisher would go, Abdu, very low on the originality stakes. Go back and rewrite that.
Yeah.
In oral cultures, it's the other way around. People want to know the familiar. So Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, they're about 25% formulaic. 25% of the text, if you took a text of Homer and underlined all the repeated phrases, a quarter of the text would be underlined.
Yeah.
In my PhD, what I did that analysis for the Quran. And basically, you know, we live in the age of AI and machine learning today. This was 10 years ago. So those tools were not nearly as advanced. So we had to write a lot of them. I've got a computer science background originally. So part of my PhD was actually programming and writing the tools so we could analyze the Quran digitally for the first time. So Homer, 25%. Nobody doubts today that Homer was an oral poet. The Quran is somewhere in the mid-40s% overall. Some parts slightly higher, some parts slightly lower. I would probably say the average about 45%.
Wow.
Double, at least double. If you take the Quran today and you go through and underline the repeated phrases, vast amounts would be underlined that way. And some repeated phrases in the Quran uses 30, 40, 50 times. A formula is used again and again and again. In other words, the Quran looks entirely as if it was composed that way. And by the way,
wow,
which couples with the legends and folklore stuff, remember that one of the fascinating things, right, is preserved in the Quran are some of the accusations that the Meccans made about Muhammad, right? Because when he was in Mecca, the first half of his prophetic career, the vast majority of people were skeptics. They didn't believe him. And what was the accusation they told? There were two accusations made. The first thing was they said, you're just repeating fables of the ancients. That's what they said. That's the accusation, which is the first thing we've talked about. But also they accused him of poetry. They said, oh, this is just poetry that you're using here. And Muhammad denied it. Now, for a long time, that gave scholars a bit of a headache, because normally it's the way around. You'd expect, say, Abdu might come in and go, I'm an amazing poet. Let me recite my poem. And maybe, Derek, you're an expert poet. You go, dude, stick to the non-fiction writing. You're not a poet. You'd expect it that way around. Muhammad to go, I'm a great poet, and the Meccans who know poetry to go, no, you're not. It's the reverse. What's going on? Well, what I've just explained and outlined explains that. Muhammad was using the method of poetry, those repeated phrases and very highly structured prose, and then putting new content into it. So the Meccans go, oh, we recognize what's going on here. Because in their mind, he was just performing like a poet. In his mind, it's like, no, I'm not, because I'm telling you new stuff. So put those two pieces together, the high amount of oral formulas, and what we can do, we could put perhaps a link in the show notes to where I've got a very short kind of paper that goes into detail.
Yeah, that would be
You
good.
can look at the examples of it. Put that together with the fables and the legends we've talked about there, and we have a very powerful argument backed up by machine learning now, showing that the Quran was composed this way. So back to your question, what does this show? So for Muslims, the headache is the Quran is supposed to be this very literate document. You know, it was written on tablets of stone in Allah from beside eternity, comes down to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel, and is now a book, as Shabir talks about. But it doesn't look like it was composed that way. It looks like it was composed by an illiterate man in the 7th century using all the tools available to you as an oral performer. And by the way, all of the weaknesses. That's why you get repeated versions. There is no one version of the Iblis and Adam story. Muhammad reconstructed it every time. And so on and so forth.
You wouldn't even need God to give you that word for word.
You have
It's all stuff that's already there.
You have very, very, very human fingerprints all over the Quran.
And would you say that this is essentially what a syncretist does? Is that what he's doing? Is it sort of a syncretistic type of thing where he's just saying, this is popular here, this is popular here, this is popular here. I'm trying to get something popular here. So let me take what's working. Is it easy? Or?
That's a great question. My only nervousness or reluctance around the word syncretism, I want to be very careful as a Christian scholar of Islam that I don't use needlessly, pejorative, needlessly insulting terms. And syncretism can, Muhammad has sometimes been accused by some scholars, including Christian ones. It's easy to go, oh, he was copying and pasting, he was borrowing, he was plagiarizing. To the oral mind, that's not what you're doing. Homer was retelling traditions that were for him. He wasn't plagiarizing. He was passing the stories on. That's what you do in orality. You've got this great tradition that you draw from and you pass on. So I think Muhammad was doing that. I think Muhammad's motives, at least initially, before he gets to Medina and political power, I actually think were probably fairly genuine. Actually, he wants to help his people. There's this great body of tradition that I'm going to shape and then remodel and he may, whether he believed, genuinely believed he was being inspired in some way. I think we're so far away we can't comment on that. But I think you don't need to go for the necessarily cynical view other than I'm drawing on this body of of tradition. What I would say you get down to, the problem you get down to is then when that gets written down, as it eventually was, and then you start trying to treat it as if it's, hard-coded sacred scripture, whether you use the argument that it's never been changed, whether you start playing the kind of games that Shabir does with, let's try and do magical numerology on it, you're completely misusing the text. That's the first thing. And secondly, if I was going to be naughty, Derek, and we Brits do have a sense of humor, I have sometimes said to Muslim friends, I do have a slightly higher view of Muhammad than most Muslims. Because most Muslims believe Muhammad was essentially a conduit. He was a pipe. Gabriel speaks into here, and then Muhammad just repeats. I'm happy to say he was the Homer of Arabia. He takes these traditions and does quite an amazing job of putting together something that certainly sounds quite beautiful. And the Quran in Arabic does sound quite attractive.
And
when
it rhymes, it's easy to memorize.
Yeah, it's easy to memorize. It's got... Well, by the way, the one thing I would say is actually... Sometimes Muslims will say maybe God revealed it this way to help it make it easy to memorize. Again, you don't memorize in oral cultures. And actually, formulas don't always make it easy to memorize things. If I say to you, as someone who grew up knowing the Quran, Allah's power over all things, what comes next? You go, truth. That formula occurs about 50 times in the Quran. It could be anywhere.
Yeah.
Where do I go next? So actually, formulas don't actually necessarily help you.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, one of the things I've often said is that when people talk about God's nature, I'd say, well, the Quran references God as merciful probably more often than anything else. One, because every chapter of the Quran, except for one, starts with the phrase Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, a far more deep version of Once Upon a Time.
Yes.
But also, he's called oft-forgiving, most merciful. So if I were to ask you, where does it say that? You have to list like 50 places, if not more, where he's called that. So it's very similar to that. And essentially, if I would just summarize the import of what you answered it quite well, and this goes back to what Shabir said, is that the evidence you've just presented on the oral formulation and the orality stuff and all this complicates the origin of the Quran beyond the simplistic view the vast majority of Muslims had of this text revealed to the mind of Muhammad over the course of 23 years, and he just said it as he heard it. It sort of says that's not, the evidence doesn't show that that simplistic story is the way it went, on top of the fact that there is this compilation history with the early Muslim communities and the various readings. Correct. It's a far more complex view of it.
It's a far more complex story. It also, by the way, and once you start viewing the Quran through that oral lens, it actually answers so many questions. It answers why the Quran is quite bitty and piecemeal, because you have stitched together things that Muhammad said under different situations. It explains why we have these repeated stories. Back to Iblis and Adam. Why do we have 7 versions of that? If Gabriel is revealing to Muhammad word for word, and Muhammad needs the story again, we'll just reveal the same words again. Why have you done now a different version? And then it also reveals one thing we haven't talked about. One of the clues, one of the things we often see in oral traditions is oral traditions are very good at preserving the shape of a story. They're often not good at preserving precise detail, places, dates, names, those kind of things. And it's long been observed in the Quran, for example. A really good example of that. You said you've done a previous episode looking at Jesus and the Quran. You probably picked up there on the fact that you look at Jesus in the Quran. If you just read the Quran and you didn't have the Bible, you wouldn't know when Jesus was born. You wouldn't know where he was born because there's no dates mentioned. Bethlehem, Nazareth, Jerusalem, all gone. You wouldn't know the political context in which he operates. No Sadducees, Pharisees. We've got no names. We've got no Herod. We've got no Pilate. We've got no Caiaphas the High. All that's gone because that's what oral cultures often do when a story is reused. That detail gets stripped away down to the bare minimum. Yeah. And of course, that's a problem for the Quran, because if you came to the Quran as an outside reader without knowing the context, you would walk away thinking Muhammad, Moses and Jesus were contemporary, because the Quran just jams them together. Classically what happens in orality. So this oral lens begins to explain the nature of the Quran that we had.
Yeah, very well.
And why it took so long for Muslims to get their head around it. Yeah. And why you have the exegetical memory loss we talked about at the start. Think of Surah 106 and Patricia Croner, those questions we touched on at the start of the podcast. We've got no way of knowing the answers, because that story that Muhammad told somewhere to somebody, by the time the first Muslim scholars 100 years later are trying to put some shape to it, the original context has gone.
Yeah.
Is that where you would say, like, if we were to say, someone might come and say, well, clearly this is what's going on in the New Testament too. You look at the synoptics, they're clearly tapping into the same story, but they're telling it differently. It's not the exact same, but there is a specificity in the New Testament
Yes.
and certain things with dates, in this year of this person's reign. Is that where you see the difference, where it's sort of engaging with
Yes.
some of the traditions, but from an eyewitness's perspective?
Well, this is, yes. I mean, what an amazing question you asked, Derek. A couple of things there. Yes, I mean, on the level of detail in the New Testament, we haven't got time to go into that on this episode, right? But if you take a book like Richard Bauckham's classic Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the amount of fine detail in the Gospels, as you say, dates, names, places. Just as an aside, I mean, I think I'm gonna get the exact numbers not right, not precise, but I'll get the ratio correct. I think the New Testament Gospels mention something like 30 to 35 different place names, going from big cities like Jerusalem to tiny one camel towns like Nazareth. And the level of geographic detail, they know which places are in the mountain, which are on the plain. They know how long it takes to travel between places on foot or on horseback or by boat. They know about economics and the agriculture patterns. They know about weather patterns, for goodness sake. Somebody wrote a PhD on meteorology in the Gospels. Because that detail's there. Because we're dealing with a literate culture. By the time the Gospels are written, all before 70 AD, all within decades of the events, you've got a literary culture. But here's the thing: Jesus, on the other hand, yes, he was literate. He was effectively a rabbi. When he goes into the synagogue in Luke 4, he unrolls the scroll of Isaiah and reads it. He's able to, exegete the Old Testament. But we also know, as he wandered around the towns and the villages, he preached orally. He preached extemporaneously. When he stands up and gives the Sermon on the Mount, he hasn't written that out and got it on his first century iPad. He's performing live in front of an audience, which is why, particularly in some of the parables, you do get those performance variants. There are performance variants in the Gospels. But here's what gets really interesting. For a long time, and you alluded to the liberal position, the critical, cynical position a while back, Derek, the cynic would say, those are not the stories of Jesus. They were invented later by the later church, hundreds of years later. Well, they've got all the hallmarks of primary orality. They look like the kind of thing that an oral preacher in first century Galilee would have produced. So you've now got a conundrum. You've either got, this incredibly clever, bunch of, naughty scholars 300 years later have been amazing at being able to reconstruct the speech patterns 300 years earlier, which itself is a miracle, or the early church really, really carefully preserved the oral form of Jesus' teaching, even while being a highly literate culture. Look at Romans and Paul there, in the 50s, writing this incredibly sophisticated, theological document, very, very highly literate culture, but they carefully preserve the stories of Jesus. So ironically, we have this tool, oral literary studies, that on the one hand completely destroys the foundations of Islam and shows that everything that Muslims have been taught about the Qur'an simply isn't what happened in the beginning. And yet that same tool affirms and encourages and gives really good evidence that with the teachings of Jesus, they've been very well preserved, even in a highly literate culture.
And that was worth you tuning in.
And Bob's your uncle, is what you would say.
Robert's your father's brother.
Yeah. Because that is, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And that helps too. I think, again, these terms get thrown out like, it's oral culture. That was passed down orally. But there are ways of understanding what that means, what it doesn't mean, that I think are helpful. And I appreciate even the approach, and you both have done this, of you're not saying anything to just in this sort of polemical or to have some apologetic against, but you're actually, like you said, and in a way, I think some people might view it as your sense of humor, but I think you really are respecting Muhammad and saying, when you say he is the Homer of that time, he is doing something quite interesting. And I think it gets, obviously because I'm not a Muslim, I think it's more interesting to hear about that version of him also.
Yeah. And by the way, just on that point, Derek, I think that's very important for Christian listeners to this. I appreciate you get a wide range of listeners to the show. But I think for Christian listeners, you don't need to demonize the other. You don't need to, go for Muhammad, with throwing everything, just hoping something will stick. I think it's perfectly possible to say you've got somebody who is incredibly, creative in the oral culture of the day. Somebody who was clearly a great leader of people and a military strategist, somebody who built the foundations of an empire, somebody who's a great inspirer of people. You can say all those things positively. And in some ways, I would say, to me, I would say something in the same way that I might speak positively about, say, Alexander the Great, who was a great empire builder. Yeah. And I don't think Alexander the Great was a prophet of God, nor do I think Muhammad was a prophet of God. I think he may have claimed that, but I would disagree. But that doesn't mean I need to write everything off. And for the Christian listener, I would just say that is as devastating an argument when you're engaging with a Muslim friend than feeling you need to fling every kind of mud and in so doing actually lose the person you're talking to because you've been disrespectful. Let's make sure that we disagree well and disagree robustly, but also do so graciously.
And that's why I'm sitting here.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here doing this show with you guys. I wouldn't have met you probably had Christians not acted that way towards me. As I've often said, I didn't reject Islam because it was false or because I heard terrible stories about Muhammad. I actually embraced the gospel because the gospel is true. Now, you begin to learn things along the road. It's like, things are not as simple as I once thought they were in this tradition I had grown up in. But that's okay. Let me find out where the truth is. You don't need to set everything on fire. You can simply say, challenge some assumptions. Here's some evidence. By the way, the thing that undermines this position actually bolsters this position. I think that's tremendous. So one of the topics I think I want to get to is, there's the common Muslim claim that the Bible has been changed, the Bible has been corrupted, and there are a number of ways you can respond to this. Often one of those is to say that the Qur'an speaks very highly of the Bible in present tense terms. In other words, the Qur'an in various places, and I've talked about this in numerous different times, references the Bible as a thing that Christians and Jews need to rely on in the sense of it existing in the 7th century in Arabia. Now, there are parts of the Quran, and we've already talked about this a little bit, where it suggests that the context has been changed or the meaning has been changed, etc. So Muslims have come to view the Bible as corrupted. But as you already pointed out, the early Muslim commentators were a little bit hesitant to say this. They had taken whole parts of the Bible and described them in their tafsir, but they weren't willing to say that the Bible's text has been changed. But later on, it became sort of standard Islamic dogma. And Gordon Nickell, who was your academic advisor for your PhD.
My examiner.
Your examiner, and someone who's written some great books. I've often referred people to the Qur'an with Christian commentary. Yeah. He's got a great book called The Gentle Answer. He did his academic work on whether or not the Qur'an actually says the Bible has been changed. And so the question then becomes, if the Qur'an doesn't say it, and the early commentators didn't say it, why do Muslims say it now?
Yeah, there's so many ways we could respond. Gordon's book is great, and there are also, he's obviously a Christian. There are non-Christians writing on this. I think it's, as a scholar called, Camilla Adang, wrote a book looking at this, at the way that early Muslims interacted with the former scriptures from a purely academic perspective. I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s that came out. And all the folks who've done work in that area share that same story. Abdu, the early Muslim commentators were very open to using the Bible. In fact, they took huge amounts of material in, and it was later that the problem arises. There's a number of reasons why. I think one reason why is this, that of course, the Quran claims, Muhammad claims, that the message he had was the same as the message of the former scriptures, right? Mm-hmm. It's all the same God, it's all one revelation, all one continuous story. Now, we talk elsewhere in this episode about the fact that, of course, the Quran comes from this oral environment where Muhammad is drawing upon stories orally. He hasn't got the Bible around at this point, so those that he's talking to can't check. If you're a Meccan
in Arabic,
yes, exactly. So if you're there, you're a Meccan or a Medinan, there's Muhammad preaching and telling you this stuff. You haven't got the ability to go. Let me go and see what the Bible says. So when later on, as Islam began expanding out of Arabia after Muhammad's death, during the time of the conquests, former Christian countries get conquered as Islam begins encroaching what was the Byzantine Empire. And eventually Muslim scholars and clerics get their hands on the Bible and begin to study it and discover, of course, their horror, this is not the same. There are profound contradictions. Just take one obvious big one. The Quran says in Surah 4, verse 157, Jesus wasn't crucified. The New Testament, he's crucified. It's
quite clearly.
quite clearly, and in many places, and Jesus prophesied his death and so on and so forth. What do you do? Well, you run into what some have called the Quran dilemma. You either have to go, well, Muhammad was wrong, or you have to go, the Christians changed their text. That's what's the original text said the same as the Quran, and those naughty Christians and the Jews for the Old Testament changed the text. And so that's what happened. That doctrine arises, sometime, 100 or 200 years after Muhammad's death, largely in that context of interreligious dialogue and debate and argument. And by the way, the Christians were giving what for as well. I mean, you could go read guys like Al-Kindi, early Christian Muslim Christian apologist, who just lets rip in terms of his view of what he thinks about it. So this was a pretty febrile period in terms of arguments. So it comes from that context, but you get behind that to the beginning. And then, as you say, you'd read the Hadith and the traditions about what Muhammad said and did. He treats the Bible with respect. That story that I think you told, there's a very famous story in the Hadith of Muhammad being brought a Jewish couple who'd been caught in adultery, and Muhammad says, "We'll let them be punished according to what their own text teaches." And he has the rabbis read, the Old Testament, and the rabbi apparently puts his hand over the verse about stoning and reads either side of it, and Muhammad says, "Lift your hand. What's written?" Okay, now let them be stoned. Nowhere does Muhammad say, I suppose this scripture's unreliable, but I'll go for this bit.
Right. Right. In fact, I think in the tradition, he has it placed on a cushion, and he says, "I believe in you and the one who revealed you."
Yeah. Then a couple of other things, as you talked about in your own testimony. There are verses in the Quran that are very, very strong. The Quran has come to confirm that which is between your hands, is the phrase in Arabic, right? Meaning by that which you have in front of you, talking about the former scriptures, implying that Muhammad is sort of saying to his audience, that which you've got, you Jews, you Christians, I'm preaching what's come to confirm that. Yeah. Third problem you run into, Muslims, as you know, have this other peculiar argument over the years where they've tried to claim Muhammad is prophesied in the Bible. So they'll go through and cherry pick verses and sort of twist them, which is interesting when you talk about twisting scriptures. There are some pretty weird ones where they'll go through all kinds of hoops to try and find Muhammad there. So you get this strange conundrum of going, okay, so the bits of the Bible that you can sort of, use in your own apologetics, they're okay. But the bits that I don't agree with, which does rather sound like you're standing judge and jury on scripture. But then Abdu, the one I've used over the years as well, I also like to bring it right down to the very, very basic and said the problem I think you run into as a Muslim, if you're saying the former scriptures have been corrupted by human beings, and so God had to send the Quran, what kind of 2-bit second-rate deity have you ended up with? So, because you had to conclude either Allah didn't have the power to protect the former scriptures, so he was up there going, "Oh man, Gabriel, the Jews, they're at it again, they're changing text, what shall I do?" And I don't know, does Gabriel finally go, "Do you know what, we know the angels have been wandering for a while, maybe it's time that you sent a book down and protected it in some way, maybe put some mathematical code in there that Shabir Ali will figure out later, do something." And I was like, oh man, I should have thought of that. You do end up with sort of high comedy that you get an incompetent deity, or you get a God who doesn't care. He could have protected the scripture. He doesn't bother. He allows human beings to go, guidanceless for centuries before finally the Quran is sent. And a Quran, by the way, that, as Shabir Ali acknowledged, is full of confusion and complexities and variant readings. And, it wasn't until the 20th century that somebody was able to go, we found this mathematical way of proving it. I mean, that's insane. As a Christian, the book of Isaiah says God's word stands forever. This is God's word. Human beings can't change sacred scripture. This is God's word. So I would always challenge my Muslim friends on going, recommend you be very careful about the way that you speak about sacred things, because God will hold us account for how we treat sacred things. So do not put yourself in a position when the day of judgment, God looks at you and says, "How dare you talk about my word this way. And the best you've got is, well, I saw some YouTube apologist do it and I copied him.
That's a great way. I'm not going to say anything. That's great. That's how you end it. I do want to make sure that we don't leave everybody hanging. We teased a couple of times now the numbers stuff.
Oh,
we got to get into the numbers stuff because to summarize, let me just summarize, because Shabir summarized it in the clip we showed, but he's got a whole show on it. Despite the fact that he recognizes that what we have today in terms of the Qur'an may or may not have been the original as Muhammad spoke it, and for the various reasons he elucidated. There are additional reasons, but he talked about the oral tradition and the different readings and the understandings and translations. He still says that somehow the Qur'an we have today, which, by the way, still is up for debate, because there's the Warsh text and there's the Has text, and they exist today and they're different. You have to pick which one you want. He said that the Qur'an we have extant today, we can know comes from God because it contains these numerical patterns within the text that could not have been the work of a 7th century, Arabian caravan owner and the various Bedouins who became the Muslims later. What he would say as examples are things like the word day occurs exactly 365 times in the Qur'an. Certain letters work when you have the opening chapters of some surahs of the Qur'an with these mysterious letters like Alif Lam Mim, and those things occur in various patterns. Multiples of 19 exist with the verse numbers and the word numbers and the various ways in which all this works. He says this is amazing, and he gives a lengthy, in fact, in the debate with Jay Smith, he gave a lengthy set of examples for all of this, which is, as you said, is probably the only place he has to go in order to prove that this thing has some kind of divine origin. That's the summary of it.
Yes.
Let's hear the response.
Well, there's so many things you could say, and it's like a lot. I'm actually going to name it like a lot of nonsense and rubbish on the internet. Sometimes it takes a lot of work to undo a lot. I remember my PhD supervisor talking about this. That some academic will float some ludicrous theory, whether it's on Christianity or Islam, and it takes 3 other PhDs to shoot down the lunatic theory because there's a lot of nonsense out there. So there's a number of things I would say.
Flat Earth is like that. You have a flat Earth person who goes on and on about flat Earth. I assume you're not a flat Earth person. And they say stuff, and you're like, well, now I have to go in through a
No, I think it's kind of bent to the edges slightly. Just to keep the water in.
But you have to have a 20-minute discussion about gravity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, that's a good, by the way, that's a serious, that's a very helpful point I actually have come across. I remember in Scotland a few years ago coming across a guy who was a serious flat earther. At first I made a joke of it, and I realized he was serious. And it took about an hour's argument because he's got, you think of, well, hang on, what about this? Well, actually, he's got his 3 things to deal with the what about this, because it's this little conspiracy theory that has its own. So don't be, just because, somebody sounds persuasive at first, just be careful. So first thing is, I would say to Shabir, and I've called him out on this in a debate, and I can't believe he's still using the day example. The word day does not occur 365 times in the Quran. No one can quite figure out how he does it, because when you search for that word, I forget the exact number, but it simply doesn't. So you have to start excluding certain things and say, well, plural versions we exclude, or this one doesn't count. So it's not as straightforward as we go, right, we just read it off this. You actually have to bend things to make the numbers fit. That would make you suspicious straight away. The same goes on with some of the other numbering patterns, and Rashid Khalifa, who this came from, was notorious for doing this. He would, how you count things is interesting. You can count things in different ways. Obviously, if you find something that fits your pattern, you trumpet it with huge noise, and you don't mention the times that things don't fit your pattern. Right. So Shabir is very careful at using selective evidence. Oh, yeah. And again, for non-mathematicians, the analogy here might be if we were to paint a, sort of target behind us on the wall here, and I'd stand at the end of the studio and fire 30 arrows into the target. And then you could say, well, I'm an Olympic class archer because look, 9 of my arrows landed in the bullseye. We just don't mention the 21 that didn't.
Right.
So numbers can prove many things. Thirdly, there's something about literature whereby numerological patterns turn up. And this is the real killer for Shabir's argument. What does the background level look like? That's important in statistics. We need to know, what does normal look like? You know, if we're going to say that you are very, very tall, Abdu, that only works if we have an idea of what's an average height for a man in the USA.
Right.
If we don't have that, then we can't talk about tall or short. What, when we when we turn to literature and we start looking for numerological patterns, what level of patterns are miraculous and what are just background noise? And this has been shown on many texts. You can pretty much take any text, and especially today, by the way, with computers, you can start going, find me some, you know, patterns in here. There was a very famous example. So the poet Edgar Allan Poe wrote a very famous poem called The Raven, which, by the way, links to Homer. Because if you want to see the best version of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, you can look for the famous Simpsons Halloween episode. Where they do the Raven, and they do the poetry quite faithfully, but the animation is amazing. And somebody some years ago went, the numerology in there, if you want to, in terms of the number of times that words appear, the number of syllables per line, pages of stuff. Now, did Edgar Allan Poe spend hours carefully putting mathematical patterns into the Raven? No. It's poetry, which already has a meter and a rhyme, and actually, therefore, mathematical patterns arise.
You would expect that to happen, actually.
Something similar happened a few years ago with the Bible. If you remember the Bible code, where there was
Equidistant letter sequencing, yeah.
Oh my word, letter sequencing in the Old Testament, where people claiming you could find predictions about all kinds of, you know, modern political events.
The JFK assassination, for example.
Moon landings are in there by, again, simply how you construct it. So we should be very suspicious. And then lastly, I think in all of this is to the return to the theological point of going, if this is the miraculous key to the Qur'an, you know, it is rather suspicious that Muhammad doesn't know about it. The first generation of exegetes don't know about it. In fact, really, it takes until the 1900s with Rashid Khalifa to go, look what I found. And by far the strongest critiques of the numerology argument have come from fellow Muslims. Yeah. And again, we can put a link in the show notes too. There was a very famous rebuttal to that written by, I forget the name of the scholar a few years ago, Saudi scholar, who went through and just eviscerated it, both on theological grounds and on mathematical grounds. But as I say, I think what I find fascinating with Shabir is I think it's tragic, Abdu, that he's lost the argument on the manuscripts. He's lost the argument on the early history. As I don't know if he's changed his view. For a long time, he wouldn't debate anything to do with Muhammad. Jay tried to debate him and others. He wouldn't touch it because I think he knows he's on huge shaky ground. But the only thing I've got to hand on to is the miraculous nature. But I think if I was being cheeky, I would say to Shabir, even if that were there, I'm not convinced it is for all the reasons we've just laid out. I would go, what makes you think it's God? Maybe it was a demon. Maybe it was some other strange spiritual entity. Maybe it was aliens. You know, what is your proof that goes from, oh, I've got enough examples of mathematical patterns to, therefore it was God?
Or even simply the sheer genius of the person who wrote it.
And by the way,
I mean, you could write a whole book without the letter E.
The other thing as well, by the way, and this is, I should have mentioned this earlier, the other thing that some scholars have suggested, and I think there is a PhD or two to do here. So if you're listening to this and you want something to do in early Islamic origins, here's an idea for you. There was a philosophical movement in the first few centuries of the Common Era known as Gnosticism, which you'll be aware of, Abdu. So this was it crops up in various forms across the ancient world. And in a nutshell, the big idea of Gnosticism was that the material world is bad, spiritual world is good. So we want to, you know, matter gets played down and denigrated, and we want to lean into spirit, mind, those kind of things. There's very weird texts out there. There have been many over the years who've suggested that early Islam was influenced by Gnosticism. There are clearly some Gnostic ideas in the Quran, whether accidentally or deliberately, as it hoovered up oral traditions. And then, because you get some strange goings on. I mean, in fact, there's 114 surahs in the Quran is interesting. There's a Gnostic early Christian text called the Gospel of Thomas, which is Gnostic and has those kind of influences. It's got 114 chapters. And one of the things the Gnostics were fascinated by was numbers. Numerology was a big thing in Gnosticism because it was the idea that if you were one of the elect, you would understand these mathematics.
Yeah, the secret knowledge.
Secret knowledge. So there's just the question out there going, if there were some mathematical patterns in the Quran, is that another sign that something that's come in through the borrowing that's going, you've got this fascination with numbers and mathematics across that part of the world. It influences Zoroastrianism as well. Is it just another sign of influence rather than anything?
Well, that's fascinating. That's it. I hadn't heard that last part. That's an interesting observation, given the Gnostic. The
114 would be just one interesting thing. Very interesting. You know, no one knows quite why, but there's clearly a thing there. Yeah. So there you go. If you're looking at if you're watching this thinking, I would love to do a PhD in early Islam, what should I do? There you go. Gnostic influences on early Islam.
That's one of the bonuses of listening to the show or watching it on YouTube, is that once in a while you get the occasional suggestion for what
There
you
you
do your PhD work in. Almost no other benefits than that.
Absolutely.
So yes, that is one of the secret benefits.
And if you get your PhD on that because of the suggestion, please do feel free to mail Starbucks vouchers to Abdu and I, Care, Embrace the Truth, Detroit.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe you'll be sitting yourself in an orange chair amongst two guys in white chairs, like you are, once they have their PhD.
Oh, that's very good.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
once it happens. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Sorry.
Come on the show. Yeah.
Following the link there. You too could be in an orange chair.
He looked at me, you should have seen the look on his face. He's like, I have no idea where that's going. I think you've lost your mind. Maybe you popped a gasket or something. Anyway.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think, that you've, I was going to ask, like, just quickly to wrap up the episode. We've talked about a lot of stuff. If you were to give, like, someone out there that's got a Muslim friend and they're having these conversations of this, I mean, there's a lot they could read on it, and obviously having a good foundation base is great before you go into conversation, so you can at least answer some questions potentially. But if they were to take something from this, how would you even just recommend, how do you bring this up, and then how do you present it in a way that's not doing the thing that is just disrespectful?
That's a brilliant question, Derek. And I'd say a couple of things there. I think the challenge with this material, it's important to be aware of it, and it's important when we talk with Muslim friends to be kind but clear that as Christians, look, Islam sits on two pillars. You often hear about the 5 pillars of Islam, but Islam itself sits on 2 pillars, right? It sits on Muhammad and it sits on the Qur'an. It's sort of balanced on those. And if one of those things goes, the whole thing collapses. Yeah. So I think to be gently saying to your Muslim friend, look, I am not at all persuaded by the claims around Muhammad, and I'm certainly not persuaded around the claims around the Qur'an. Even if you just remember there is lots of confusion and lots of difficulty and lots of contention around how Islam came together, acknowledged by Muslim scholars. That's the first thing. Secondly, when your Muslim friend makes any claim about the Quran says or Muhammad said, just stop them and say, can you tell me how we know? I want to know how we know that these things are true. Because, I believe because I believe is not good enough. Muhammad is a prophet. Why do we know that? The Quran's a miracle. Why do we know that? Where's your evidence? Can you point me to it? But then here's the important thing. If you go too far down that rabbit trail, it can become a rabbit trail. Because I learned in my early engagements with Muslims, I look back now and realize, that the mistake I sometimes made was I could spend an hour with a Muslim friend arguing about the origins of Islam and not mention Jesus once. So I want to get to Jesus. Just remember that in whatever you do, that to say it's good to talk about these things, but look, the most important thing to be talking about is Jesus. So in your conversations with your Muslim friends, that's where you want to be going. Now, one way you can bridge across those, by the way, I found with Muslims over the years, is to be looking for opportunities to say, look, one of the things I appreciate about Islam is you folks take Jesus seriously, right? Your Muslim friend is likely to say yes, he's a great prophet in Islam. And then say, well, and I understand the Quran, talks about the fact he taught people. And then if your Muslim friend knows the Quran, they'll say yes. What's your favorite teaching or story or sermon of Jesus from the Quran? Well, there's nothing there. And to say, well, would you mind if I shared with you one of Jesus's stories? I don't want to be rude about what you believe, but let's take a look at something Jesus taught and then use that as a bridge into the gospel. Now, some Muslims will not go there. Others will, because that's a gentler way in. And then I found a great story to start with, and I'd love to get your take on this, Abdu. I mean, I've often found things like the Good Samaritans are quite a good place to start. It's not too controversial. It's a very strong justice theme, which Muslims are drawn to. And now you're talking about Jesus' teaching, and you're drawing people towards the gospel. And from there, you can go to other things. So I'm always looking for that bridge. So use this material, ask questions, challenge, poke away. If you're somebody who's a reader and a thinker, dig more deeply. We've alluded to some things that you can follow up on. There's other episodes of the show. But make sure that we're not just having arguments about Islamic origins and neglecting to come across to Jesus. Because I think, in your journey, right, it was the attraction of Jesus far more than the questions about the foundations. They were important, right? But they were not the main thing. Or the only
I wasn't so much repelled as I was compelled.
And then I think of our dear late friend Nabil Qureshi. I love the title of his book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And again, apologetics was important for him, but it was the attraction. So let's make sure that we talk about that.
Well, I couldn't agree on a better way to end the episode. Do you have a closing argument?
Let's hear it.
But it's brief. It's very brief. You've heard a lot today. I mean, there's just a ton. So do go back, and because Andy and I both are quick speakers, don't play it at 1.5 speed. You'll go nuts. Play it at 0.75, and you'll be fine.
When I talk, move it up to 1.5.
Yeah.
But
But there's so much rich stuff in here. I would urge you to seriously listen to it again or watch it again. And we have some great links in the show notes or in the description as well in the YouTube channel for you to get some resources that are there. But let's focus on Andy's point at the end, because this really is the closing statement. Yes, Islam has a much more complicated history than most Muslims actually will acknowledge or know about. Much more complicated. They will have a sort of a paradigm shift when you would even talk about the fact that some of their own experts will agree that this history is not nearly as neat and tidy as most Muslims will have had them believe. And then when they see some of this stuff on the oral formulation and other areas of the issues of the origin of the Qur'an, it'll begin a bit of a paradigm shift in their thinking about how their system of belief was actually formed. But you have to get to the person of Christ. You have to get there. The Qur'an mentions Jesus far more directly than Muhammad. And yet it doesn't describe who he is. It doesn't describe what it means for him to be Messiah. It doesn't describe his teaching. It doesn't tell you who his disciples are. It assumes you know that. It assumes you know that. But you can go and tell your Muslim friends, you don't have to assume anything anymore. In fact, you probably don't know much of the things the Quran assumes you know. But the Bible that was extant, not in Arabic necessarily, but was extant in the 7th century in Arabia when Muhammad spoke those words that became the Quran. That Bible describes who Jesus actually is. And it's that source that we can look to and turn to for a fuller understanding of history's most important figure. So that's what I got. That's my closing statement. Until next time, friends, the defense rests.